Hello, everyone. Welcome to our IELTS speaking webinar with MedCognito. We're so excited to have you all today. So the IELTS speaking test is a really interesting test, and I think that once you have the backgrounder that we're going to talk about here, we'll jump into a couple of example questions, and then we'll talk a little bit about the strategies that MedCognito has to bring success to test takers and make sure that you're equipped with all of the right techniques so that you can have flying colors on this part of the exam and get the desired banding that you're looking for. So the speaking portion of the IELTS exam is one-on-one with an examiner. Usually it takes about 11 to 14 minutes. And you start off with an identity check. And usually this is just, asking your name, your ID. And at this point, you're going to want to make sure that you have everything that you need. Your identification is crucial. So making sure that you have your passport or your driver's license. And then jumping into part one of the actual test is the small talk portion, part two, which is the 2-minute talk, and then part three, which is the discussion. The scoring criteria used in this section covers a range of things. The first is fluency, and so that's speaking without hesitation at a pretty moderate pace. And this is really important because it's very easy to tell when there's hesitation in the speech. And of course, this gets better with practice and with time. The second is coherence, making sure that you have ideas that flow logically and create good sentences with good structure. The third is vocabulary range, so using a broad range of words and vocabulary to express yourself clearly and to describe your ideas. The next is vocal precision, so selecting the right words to convey the thoughts as you intend them to be received. Next is grammatical range, having a variety of sentence types and a variety of sentences so that you're able to express your ideas in different ways. Grammatical accuracy, so using different tenses, prepositions, and also using them correctly when you do use them. And the next is pronunciation, so pronouncing the words that you're using accurately. All of these different scoring criterias take time and they take practice. And they're usually not things that you'll get right away. But with some of the techniques that I'll share today in this webinar, you can expect that you'll receive flying colors on the speaking portion of the IELTS exam. So success in the IELTS speaking exam, I think I put it down to one thing. I think a lot of students feel that, you have to have particular and correct answers in order to get through this portion of the exam and do it well. But the one thing that people seem to miss is that there are no correct answers. For all of these questions that come up in the speaking exam, I'm sure many of you have looked at examples of speaking questions. There are no correct answers. The only thing that is important is that the ideas that you talk about are well developed. And there are some techniques that we use in the MedCognito course to equip our students to be able to develop these ideas and actually convey them with accuracy. The first is introducing your answers with time. And so what do I mean by this with time? So as an example of this could be, I went to go and watch the movie last week. So that's a way that you could introduce your answer with time. The second is comparing past and present in your answers. So talking about a past experience and bringing it into the present of the question that you're answering. The next is talking about past habits with the conversation that you're presently having with who you're testing with. The next one is using emotions in your answer. So that way you can evoke emotion from whoever is testing you, and also that the emotion that you bring to your answers will help convey a particular message. And one of my favorites is providing a backstory, but a backstory that is accurate and within the time constraints that you have for the speaking test. And a lot of these techniques we talk about through the IELTS speaking course with MedCognito. And the really interesting thing about these techniques is that No matter what questions you're asked, they go with all of the questions that are brought up in the speaking exam. And when the answers that you're giving are well developed with these different techniques, you're able to find success and get the bands that you're looking for. So let's start with the identity check. You can answer back with me. So I will read the questions and then we'll kind of go into what your answers can look like. For this section, it's not part of the actual exam, but I think it's good to practice this piece so that you're ready to, dive into the rest of the exam. So we'll start with the identity check. Hello, what is your full name? And before we continue, if you're not able to speak out loud to yourself, feel free to write it in the chat using proper punctuation. Can you tell me where you are from? May I see your identification? And so this identity check gives you a chance actually to kind of exercise that speaking piece of the exam and get comfortable and take a breath before you start the next section. The first piece we're going to talk about is part one of the speaking, which is small talk. And with the small talk, you will have a variety of topics. You might focus on work, school, hobbies, art. And a lot of these questions are very simple, and it's very easy to make errors when you're answering the questions. So we're going to go through a few examples. So we have 3 questions we're going to review for part one, small talk. Let's talk about your hometown. Where is your hometown? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? These 3 questions are pretty simple. It's very easy to give one-word answers or answers that are not fully developed. As you can see, there's not necessarily a correct way to answer these questions. There's a variety of ways to approach them. Let's take a look at some of the examples that are rated higher on the band scale that would give you higher points for questions like these. Let's start with the first question. Let's talk about your hometown. I'm not talking about my hometown specifically, but I've given an example of one in the next slide. Let's talk about your hometown. Where is your hometown? A typical answer to this is my hometown is in a tiny village in Malaysia. It is about 40 kilometers away from any major city. Most people won't be able to find it on a map. In this answer, you can see that the hometown is provided, as well as some corresponding information that supplements that. It would be very easy to just say that first sentence, my hometown is in a tiny village in Malaysia, because that does answer the question, but it doesn't give enough context to the person that will be testing you. And it's important that you provide that context and build the story based on the questions that you're given. Let's look at the next one. What do you like about it? I like how the people in my hometown are so friendly and the way that everyone knows everyone. It's a really close-knit community, which is hard to find in big cities. Again, in this response, it would be very easy to simply say that first line, which answers the question. But it's important to continue to add context that rounds your answer and adds a little bit of excitement to the question that you're asked. And the third piece, what do you like about it? Well, I suppose my least favorite thing about it is that there aren't too many fun things to do or see. It's not the most exciting place, so sometimes I feel a little bored. This answer here is very good because it gives a bit of insight into why it might not be this individual's favorite place. And it talks a little bit about, on top of that, why the place itself is not so fun or there aren't things to do because it is far away from a larger city and there aren't exciting things to do. And so these answers that we've seen in the past 3 questions, they're very simple, but it's very easy to see where We don't get to the higher band because we aren't expanding and giving context to our sentences, and they aren't necessarily detailed enough. So please keep that in mind as you're reviewing and practicing for part one of the small talk, because it's easy to, as you can see, right, when you were thinking about and answering the questions as when we went through them in the first slide, not giving enough context or examples for your answers. Let's dive into part two, which is the 2-minute talk. Again, this portion is on a variety of topics that encompass work, school, hobbies, and you'll be given a piece of paper and pen and also a task card. And the task card will include a prompt, 3 points, and an additional sentence. You'll be given 1 minute to prepare to speak on whatever questions are indicated on the task card. And usually these task cards are about persons, events, places, or objects. You don't necessarily have to have strong opinions on these particular task cards, but it's important that you're able to develop the information that you answer through these task cards. So this one focuses on novels or books that you've read recently. And I think this one really trips people up because, what if you are not a reader? What if you haven't read something recently? It's important in preparation for this exam that you have some literature or reading material that you've thought about, that you would like to indicate as part of this test, because this is usually a prompt that is used. So let's start with these questions here. So this is our task card in front of us, and our 3 questions here are: you should be able to say how and why you got it, how long it took you to read it, or how long you've been reading it, what kind of book is it, and say if you would like to read something else similar or not, and why. So I'm going to give you some time to think about this question, maybe about a minute. And in the chat box, please respond with some of your answers. Doesn't have to be anything too long, but make sure it's detailed and it provides a little bit of context. So this response to these questions is on the screen. I'm going to go through and read the response itself, but I just want to remind you of the questions. The first is talk about a book you're reading now or you've read recently, and you should say how and why you got it, how long it took you to read it or how long you've been reading it, what kind of book it is, and you should say if you would like to read something else similar or not, and why. So I'd like to talk about Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which is a book I finished reading recently. As you can see, the first technique that we discussed in the previous slide of timing is used in the beginning here. This book is part of a popular fantasy series for children, but in fact, I decided to start reading it to study English. I'm already familiar with the story from the films, which makes it easier for me to focus on the language while I read. I'm not usually interested in fantasy books, but the characters and the story are interesting and fun to read about. As for how I got into this book, I got this book from the local library after I finished reading the last book in the series a few weeks ago. The book is fairly long, So it took me a little less than a month to finish reading it. A few weeks is longer than it usually takes for me to read books in my own language, but I think it's a little more difficult for me to read books in English. In the future, I plan to read every book in the Harry Potter series because I'd like to know what happens next. I've noticed that my English vocabulary has already improved somewhat, so I feel motivated to keep on reading. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban is a great book to practice English and has an entertaining story too. I'll start reading the next book in the series as soon as I can. So this example uses a lot of the techniques that we already discussed earlier in the presentation. And I think it's really important to note that even though the question could have been answered in a shorter period of time, there's a lot of context that's given in this response that you can really only get through utilizing those techniques that we talked about earlier and ensuring that you're adding context to your answer. Don't assume that the person that you're speaking with has a knowledge of the topic or the book that you're discussing, and you're able to educate them at the same time as you're able to give them context into your own world and the responses that you're required to give. So the next piece is the deep discussion. And so topics usually in this deep discussion piece are the ones that were discussed in part two, but you're now using in further detail. And grading for this is based on your language skills. So not necessarily on the accuracy of your answers or how well you're able to, talk about the Harry Potter book that was just mentioned, The Prisoner of Azkaban, but the way that you use language. So the three questions we'll be going through are, do people read more nowadays? Do you read before going to bed? And do you read the traditional literature of your country? So these three questions, as we've discussed before, are very simple, and it's very easy to give a yes or a no answer to questions like this. But it's important to understand that, again, context has to play a role in your answers, and using a variety of vocabulary is going to help to build your answer and also the scoring that you'll receive. So I'll give you a moment to look at these questions and think about them, and then we will jump into the answers, the metcognito answers. And we are back. Let's jump into some of the answers to these questions now. Do people read more nowadays? I think that's tough to say, but all in all, I would guess that people today read less than people in the past did. Take someone like my mom, for example. In the past, she was a very avid reader and would finish at least a few books every week. These days, she still reads occasionally, but with all of the great TV shows available to stream instantly, she actually spends a lot more time watching TV. So I think people today read less because of the wide availability of other sources of entertainment like TV. Let's jump into the next question answer. Do you read before going to bed? If I do read, it's usually when I'm trying to pass the time, like on the train or in the car. I rarely read at home because I actually spend quite a bit of time on my computer or watching TV. If I do read before bed, I get sleepy. I usually end up falling asleep with the book on my face, which is not a pleasant experience when I wake up. and later have to reread the page again because I was too tired the first time. That's why I don't read much before going to bed. Do you read the traditional literature of your country? Yes, I love it. Reading traditional literature brings me closer to the country that I live in, and it is very enjoyable. Because when you read literature from a particular country, you get to know more about its culture, and it is truly my dream to explore my country and understand it more deeply. So, success in the IELTS speaking part of the exam, as I said before, is that there are no correct answers, only very well developed ideas. It's important to introduce your ideas with time. So if the question, for example, like we reviewed in section 2, asks about a book you read recently, it's important to give context to when you read the book. If it's something you finished last week, if it's something you read over a year ago, include that as part of your answer. It's important, and it shows that you're able to communicate that to the person who is testing you. Next is to compare the past with the present in your answers. In the examples that we reviewed, we're able to see that the responses compared the past in terms of interest of reading with now the present reading of the Harry Potter books. The next is to talk about past habits with the present conversation and using emotions in your answers to be able to communicate how you feel about the questions that are being asked and help the test taker understand a little bit more about why your answers are the way they are. And my favorite, as I mentioned before, is providing a backstory. If you're able to use more vocabulary in the backstory, you can include a little bit of emotion there, talk a little bit about the past and the present, and utilize time to make sure that your answers are contextual to what is being asked.